The depraved raiders of the Dark Eldar are on the rise, so let's talk about starting a Drukhari army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about getting a Drukhari collection off the ground and mustering a murderous and deadly raiding force from a standing start. In the video we'll talk about why you might want to collect a Drukhari army, planning one out, a quick review of their combat patrol and other good kits to buy, and how you might start to think about expanding once you've established a core force. Plenty to talk about, so let's just jump straight in. So first up, let's talk about the things that might tempt you to collect Drukhari in the first place. In the lore, the Drukhari or Dark Eldar are essentially the portion of Eldar society that fell into depravity during the Fall and managed to escape the consumption of Slaanesh by hiding in the webway. They lurk in the hellish nightmare city of Commorragh, overflowing with every vice imaginable, and strike force only to raid, steal resources, and carry away living beings back to the darkness to feed their murderous society with its need for pain, suffering, and souls. I would say that they're perhaps one of the single most evil factions in all of 40k. They're not fighting to reclaim the galaxy, simply for the fun of a good fight, or even to please twisted deities. They strike force to inflict pain, misery, and suffering at every turn, caring little for the higher politics or machinations of some of the other races. Miniature-wise, much of the faction is from around about a decade ago, so are technically a little bit dated, but to be honest they hold up incredibly well. I think they were released at a fortunate time, a bit of a turning point in Games Workshop's abilities with plastic kits, and looks-wise the range holds up incredibly well today. Probably the biggest gripe with the Drukhari range at the moment is that it does have a fair few of its units still in fine cast resin, things like mandrakes or grotesques, which can often mean that it might be more sensible to convert miniatures for those models as opposed to buying the Games Workshop one. As factions go, I would say that Drukhari are likely to be one of the factions that aren't supported quite as well as others by Games Workshop. I wouldn't just be starting them in the hope that Games Workshop might regenerate the whole range like they seem to be doing with Necrons and maybe Orcs. Gameplay-wise, the Drukhari offer a very different experience compared with a lot of other factions. Their units tend to be really fast, really hard-hitting, but generally fairly fragile. Things like lightly armed but deadly melee troops jumping out of reasonably fragile skimmers tend to be a very typical build for the Drukhari. In-game at the moment, the Drukhari have it pretty lucky to be honest. Their 9th edition codex was written really nicely in covering different playstyles. You can easily mix and match forces from the warrior cabals, witch cults or homunculus covens, and potentially have multiple different fighting styles within the same list. At the moment, as well as being quite flexible, the codex is also one of the strongest codexes in all of Warhammer 40k, and currently at time of recording, which is before the Abmech Dex releases, Drukhari certainly seem to me to be the strongest faction in the entire game. Their sweeping tournaments left, right and centre have a crazy win ratio, and in terms of sheer power, it looks like it's hard to go too far wrong. We've talked about their strongest builds on the channel before, but it's mainly around murderous melee units jumping out of the cheap and really quite tough raiders for the points, backed up by some incredibly hard-hitting characters and a few sturdy units from the homunculus covens. Being very fast with lots of troops also helps out with 9th edition missions, both of those are generally good for winning the game as a whole. Though, as always with Warhammer 40k, bear in mind that army strength waxes and wanes over time. I'm sure as 9th edition goes on, we'll see changes or updated codexes that make other factions equally strong or stronger than the Drukhari. So presuming you do want to take the plunge, let's talk about planning a Drukhari list. As always when approaching a 40k army, it's worth having a play around with some army list ideas, maybe using Warhapedia, Battlescribe or the Warhammer app, all of which could allow you to mess around with some ideas that you like, see some of the rules, and get a feel as to whether or not you're actually going to enjoy the faction. If you play Tabletop Simulator, you could also think about trying out a game or two there. It might help you decide which units that you like the most, and perhaps guide some purchases. From there, I'd first think about using a small force to start with and build up, and I think that Drukhari are somewhat uniquely lucky in this respect, in that they can usually tend to function around small patrol detachments, where the only minimum requirement is one HQ and a troop slot. It means that you can collect in very small chunks if you want to, building them up with a couple of units at a time. Otherwise, in the planning phase, you could think about looking at colour schemes. You could have different schemes for the cabals, witch cults and covens, though personally I prefer a bit more of a cohesive look on the table, so I'd probably all paint them the same colour scheme. There's plenty of scheme ideas in the codex, and you could always make your own. I tend to see quite a lot of Eldari armies that have been airbrushed. It can work really quite well with the sleek and fast looking skimmers like jet bikes, reavers or raiders, and can save you a lot of legwork and make some nice effects over the flat panels. You might also think about transport solutions for the Drukhari. Out of all the factions in 40k, they might just be one of the ones with the most fragile models. They've got quite a lot of pointy spiky bits hanging out, and it might be worth thinking about how you're going to transport them just a bit more than some other models. If you're feeling industrious, then I've certainly seen people use things like magnetized carry cases, say when you attach a very strong magnet to the bottom of a model's base and stop it moving around in transport. Whatever solution that you go for though, it is something that's worth bearing in mind. When planning the army list, you could think about which cabals, cults or covens to go for. There's a fair few options within the codex, and they might tempt you towards certain units over another, and I did make a video on the subject if you're interested, so feel free to give my cabals, cults and covens video a search if you'd like. You could certainly go just for literally one of them and build up an entire army around that, or go for a bit more of a mixed raiding force. I think in general the mixed forces do tend to be a little bit stronger in game, as you're not arbitrarily cutting yourself out of a bunch of options. So let's talk about a few kits that you could think about starting with then. Perhaps foremost amongst the options is this shiny new Combat Patrol Drukhari box set. This was released with the 9th edition codex. It's £85, $140 or €110. If you happen to live within the UK, you could think about picking it up from Element Games, which I have a link to in the video description. It's only £72.25 from them, so you do save a little bit of money. That one is an affiliate link, so anything bought through it does help out the channel as well. Certainly if you have discount retailers in your area, it's always worth thinking about when you're buying Warhammer products. In any case, out of all of the Combat Patrol boxes that have released for 9th edition, I think that this one for Drukhari could easily be one of the best. In it you get an Archon, a Raider, a Ravager, 5 Incubi and 10 Cavalite Warriors. It's not bad to get 5 different units for that cost, and it's certainly a pretty decent self-contained force all of its own. The savings pretty extreme as well. You get around about £134 or $223 of models if you bought them all separately. So it's around about a 37% discount just on its own, even bought directly through Games Workshop. So for Games Workshop standards, it's really not a bad deal at all. The reason that I like this one so much is that basically every single unit is very usable. Archons have tons of synergies within the codex, whether they're leading a realspace raid or making enemy units fight last. Cavalite Warriors are nice cheap fire support and objective holding squads. Incubi really are rock stars of the codex, being really solid anti-everything melee that's going to cut through whatever they contact. Raiders are an amazingly good transport. They're the unit that makes all of the fragile infantry work so well, really fast, pretty hard hitting with that damage D3+3 Dark Lance, and also surprisingly hard to remove with that 5+ invul save. Finally, Ravagers are just solid manoeuvrable firepower, pretty scary with a few Dark Lances, but if I were getting this kit I'd certainly think about magnetising the sponsons off and maybe being able to proxy it as another Raider. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Ravagers, but it never hurts to have the flexibility, and it might save on doubling up on some skimmer holes. Overall, I'd say that this set is excellent and a really solid option for getting into Drukhari right now. Otherwise, there's plenty of other things that you could consider for starting to get into Drukhari, including if you can find any more copies of the Old Start Collecting Drukhari box or the Piety and Pain box about. The Old Start Collecting Drukhari is the one that's pictured here, a far more witch cult flavoured box, a succubus, 10 witches, 3 reavers and a venom. Again, it gives you pretty reasonable discounts and actually pairs pretty well with the new Drukhari box. Putting the two together, you've got quite a well-rounded force emerging already. Piety and Pain could be another discount option if you can find any mystical copies of it floating around. That was the limited run Drukhari vs Sisters box set, and it's also quite similar, giving you Lilith Hesperax, witches, scourges and a venom. However, at the moment both of these are out of print, so you're not going to be able to get them from Games Workshop. It'd be either looking on eBay or seeing if they might appear in any local gaming shops which might still have copies. The other thing that you'd want when you're starting out with Drukhari is the Codex. It's £30 or $50 and is likely to be a good early purchase, so you can get better familiarised with the army, plus having a fair bit of lore, background and painting stuff as well, which doesn't hurt when you're getting started with a collection. In terms of other plastic that you could buy, as usual I'd normally recommend starting with either the core units to field your detachments for the army, things like troops, HQs, or hefty damage dealing units, or just anything that you think is really cool and is going to motivate you to keep on going. Say if you absolutely love the look of the Void Raven bomber or something, there's no harm in getting one slightly earlier than might be more sensible if it is going to motivate you on and you really like the model. Fortunately, quite a lot of Drukhari units are just very usable at the moment. Things like witches, raiders, succubi, helions, reavers and incubi are all really solid picks. In particular, I think that a good core of raiders is going to be at the heart of almost every Drukhari force. At the moment they're really good and they make a lot of the other units work. After you've got a small core force put together and maybe started to get a bit of paint on and a few games with the models, you could then think about starting to expand the army bit by bit. For individual units, I'd think about looking at cheaper options where you can. You could think about eBay or second-hand models, though as I said you are at a little bit more risk as Drukhari miniatures do tend to be a little bit fragile. Compared with some, there is just a little bit more chance of them getting damaged in the post. I'd typically expand in a few small jumps, maybe getting something like 1 to 3 units at a time, get them assembled and painted and on the table, and then move on to the next. It can help stop you from going down the wrong direction too hard if your plans do change while you're building up the collection. In terms of some of the other units that would really interest me, Drazzar's a ridiculously fighty character and Incubi are great melee beatsticks. 1 or 2 really small units of mandrakes can be really handy for objectives, jumping all over the board with their fade away ability. Scourges can give you a little bit of pinpoint firepower, deep striking and hitting the enemy very hard, and racks can make for some sturdy objective holders, and in particular are brutally efficient with liquefire guns combined with the Dark Technomancer's combo right now. A couple of those guys can put a lot of hurt on virtually anything. I think Drukhari are quite a freeing army to collect at the moment, as almost nothing in the entire codex is objectively bad or redundant. I did a Drukhari tier list, which again you're welcome to search if you'd like, where I talked about the various strengths of the units. I'd say perhaps Lilith Hesperax is one of the only models that you could argue is a bit redundant. She's just not as fighty as a regular succubus, but I think that competitive arguments could be made for literally every other single unit in the entire dex. Finally, if you're thinking about picking up resin units, things like the Grotesques or the Beast Packs, it does seem to be the norm for Drukhari players to convert alternatives to these, as opposed to using the ones directly from Games Workshop. In particular, Grotesques, if you buy the resin kit from Games Workshop, that'll only give you just one monopose miniature, and you're usually going to want quite a lot of them. It'd be very expensive to build up units of the things, and a common conversion that I've seen is things like Rat Ogres or Skaven Storm Vermin, combined with a bunch of Drukhari parts, maybe from Talos or Kronos perhaps, and you can make some pretty effective looking Grotesques. It's pretty similar for things like Beast Packs, Razorwing Flocks, Clawed Fiends or Chimerae, where you really have the scope for doing a bit more of imagination there. You can use just about any fantasy beasts, hounds or swarms, and just try and keep the models roughly the same size so you're not changing things up too much for line of sight purposes. It seems pretty reasonable though, seeing as the Drukhari could feasibly field virtually any beast that they could collect from real space, and the galaxy is very big. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a little bit of discussion around collecting Drukhari. Hopefully some of that's been helpful. And as always, if there are any experienced Drukhari generals watching this, feel free to share any of your pearls of wisdom down in the comments below. It'll certainly be fun to have a read, and you might help out some new players as well. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly be keeping the Warhammer 40k content coming, with new videos out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention one way to help support the channel, which is my Element Games affiliate link down in the video description. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Element Games is a discount retailer based in the UK. They usually give 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's miniatures, and have always been very reliable whenever I've ordered anything from them myself. If you click through in the link in the video description, a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics whenever you buy something from them, and it doesn't cost you any more when you order, so it can just be a way to help support the channel on things that you might have bought anyway. For people who are in the USA and Canada, I do also have an Amazon link for there. That one works in basically the same way. Buy literally anything off Amazon that you were going to anyway, and a small amount goes to help support the channel. Just another way that you can help out if you'd like to. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.